Hello, I'm Chuck Wolf, Chief Executive for Charles J. Wolf Associates, LLC. As a motivational speaker and a leadership consultant and executive coach and trainer, I often work with very successful people in their companies. Since many can't afford a professional, I volunteer to host a radio talk show called The Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel, on a nonprofit community radio station in Bridgeport, Connecticut, WPKN. My reason for doing the show is to share with as many people as possible this wonderful process for helping people manage their own emotions and their relationships with others. My goal is for everyone listening to learn to use the Emotion Roadmap to make life better. As you listen to me, help others, I hope you are also learning. As a Simsbury resident, I'm delighted to be able to make the show available through Simsbury TV. To learn more, go to my website, www.emotionroadmap.com. Thank you for listening and watching.
Hi, this is Chuck Wolf. You're listening to the Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel on WPKN 89.5 FM, listener-supported radio. And you can also listen to us streaming at wpkn.org. I am replaying a show that I think is really timely for all of you. It has to do with trying to cope with holidays where we can't get together and we're forced to stay inside and socially distance and all the things going on with the pandemic and everything else in the world. And I thought one of my colleagues, Gitu Barwani, who will tell you a little bit about herself in a minute, we had a great show together around emotional resilience, the book she wrote about it, and some techniques that I think will be helpful to you during these challenging times. Enjoy.
Hi, Chuck. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I absolutely love your show. I think, this intention to actually help people do better with emotions in everyday life, I think it's a fabulous mission and one I absolutely love. So how I got into doing what I'm now doing with emotional resilience is I've spent the last 17 years focusing on emotional intelligence as a concept. And from about 11 years ago, my dad is no longer with us. He died of a stroke a year ago. But in his last 10 years of life, he was constantly saying, there's great wisdom of how to actually manage emotion on a daily basis that you have now been forming. And maybe you need to write this book and get this message out there. So that's really how I've come to have written this new book, Emotional Resilience.
Well, you have a definition that I found that I thought was really interesting. You talk about emotional resilience as the ability to continually choose the feelings, thoughts, and actions that help you achieve results and perform at your best at personal, team, and organizational levels. And I just want to make the comments, particularly for people who are regular listeners of the show, that we're always talking about taking the wheel and controlling how you feel. The tagline is all about this idea that you can actually choose feelings, choose thoughts, choose actions. And you've described that as resilience. So I think it's very consistent with what we're doing on the show. I think a lot of people feel like they have to play the hand they're dealt, as a metaphor, I guess. Whatever you are feeling, you're stuck with those feelings, and you just have to learn how to deal with them and bite your lip and just move on and deal with whatever it is that's happening. And I think what you've said is that, no, you've got choices. And if you could talk a little bit about that definition and how you arrived at that to describe resilience, emotional resilience.
Yeah, I think, Chuck, something that's really something that's been really key is that in the early days of focusing on emotion, I used to think that there was one tool or one measure that would give you the entire solution to how to deal with emotion. And I realized about 5 years ago that this isn't the case, really, that no matter how much self-awareness we have, it's really what we do in the moment. So in that definition that you just shared, the ability to continually choose is how I think about it, that it's a moment-by-moment thing. It's not just something that we know how to do yesterday. So, yesterday I was really unhappy with a particular customer service interaction. But, even though I'm self-aware, I still now need to know what to do in that particular moment, given that set of context and that particular set of circumstances. So that's why I think about it as continual, because I think where a lot of us get stuck is where, we build the self-awareness, we know what we naturally are, but then what do we actually do in the moment? So that's really what, how I think about emotional resilience, that yes, it's about emotion, but it's a combination of thinking what is the emotion, but also what's the thought that's going to help me in this situation, but also what can I actually do that's going to make a difference. And I think up until, the last 3 years, I wasn't really thinking about it that way.
Well, I think the idea of evolving and trying to blend, heart and head, thinking and feeling, this whole concept that we've both been working on for a long time, I know for myself that over time, sometimes I'll know what the right answer might be after the fact. But the key thing for me is sometimes, is there something that I can recognize when I'm about to do something that may be wrong, inappropriate, incorrect at some level emotionally, and catch myself ahead of time so that I learn to be better the next time. That's part of it too, I think.
Yeah, I think also, what you said earlier about however we deal with things is what we're stuck with in some ways. I think having that really clear understanding of what are the underlying aspects of how we handle emotion that we need to take care of. So, for example, I used to think that, if we learn how to manage emotion, and I know that's part of the, the emotion roadmap, how do we actually manage emotion? Well, I've learned that actually if we really look carefully at our histories and understand what our natural leaning is in the way of emotion management. So, if we had a lot of trauma or a lot of addiction, if we were around a lot of addiction early in our lives, that will make it even more challenging to handle emotions of various types. So I think this whole notion of how we look at our self-worth and particularly how we look at self-care is really important.
Well, that kind of leads a little bit into your framework for how you talk about personal and team resilience. You want to talk a little bit about how the book kind of gives you kind of a template or a process or a way of thinking about how resilience, emotional resilience comes about?
Sure, absolutely. So the first thing I want to say about the framework is that when I started to look back at 20 years of coaching leaders, I noticed that the things that were in those histories of conversations were all very similar themes. So the emotion language actually would often translate into then what would you do around life goals? What would you do around specific interactions at work? So what I tried to do with my framework is to actually acknowledge the full range of topics that matter for emotion development. So at the beginning, I think about six essentials that affect our default level of emotional intelligence. And I think about those as the combination of self-worth, self-control, mood, which is all about how we handle ourselves fundamentally on the inside, together with empathy, caring, and understanding, which is all about how we interact with others. So those 6 topics really give us the essentials. And if you imagine it as a sort of funnel, these are the ingredients that go into the top of the funnel. And then how they get worked on is through the use of 5 very specific emotion-based skills. And the way I conceptualize those as the ability to shift emotions, shifting, the ability to problem-solve emotions, the ability to express emotions, the ability to read emotions in a group, which I call group empathy, and finally, dialogue, which is having dialogue about emotions that are more difficult in a group situation. So that's what the process is of working with our essentials. And then when we look at what then comes out of the funnel is typically an ability to do 4 things which matter for success in life, including success in work. So those would be our ability to connect with other people one-to-one. Secondly, our ability to influence others. Thirdly, our energy and how we manage our energy on a daily basis. And fourthly, our ability to thrive. In other words, how we set our life goals and take action on them. So that's how I conceptualized it.
So as we spend the about 45, 50 minutes together that we're going to talk this morning, I just want to tell everyone that's listening that the ability to go through and understand each of those pieces will take a longer time than the time we have for the show. But I've picked out some key topics I thought that people will listen to and not only find interesting, but also find some very practical tips, because the show's all about trying to give people ideas about things that they can actually take away and do something different that makes life better. And so one of the things that really struck me right away in that framework you talked about is this idea of self-worth. This whole concept of how do we feel about ourselves is so critical to so many things in life. And you talk about ways that, first of all, you talk about really where it comes from, and that's useful to understand a little bit about its impact and its origins, but also how might people increase the feelings they have about their own self-worth. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Chuck, I really love the quote from French philosopher Jean de la Bruyère, which is, a person's worth in this world is estimated according to the value they put on themselves. And I find, I started with self-worth because, as you said, it's absolutely at the crux of the beginning, the starting point of how we handle emotions. So our self-worth really is a combination of our self-respect, but also our personal belief that we are valuable in whatever we're doing. And this is set from a very young age. And as I said earlier, if we grew up around a lot of chaos in our families of origin, this can become a really difficult concept. And in business, I meet many, many high achievers who might have come from stable backgrounds on the face of it, but when you go into their stories, there's often a lot of trauma and chaos in those early stories. So one of the things that is the first thing to notice is what is the everyday commentary going on in our minds as we approach things, and particularly when we approach difficult situations that we're facing. Is the everyday commentary, I can't do this, or I don't have a right to do this. So I just give you a classic example. I was singing in a concert on Sunday, just a couple of days ago, and we were part of a big community concert, and we are a choir of about 23 people. And when we came out of our dress rehearsal, which was the first time we met the other 90 singers on the day, there were a number of people in our choir who didn't feel happy about the dress rehearsal and about the quality of the singing that they heard. And when I asked the question, well, who could you talk to about this? A number of people said, well, it's not my right to say this. And so what I've learned over time is that some people really don't actually feel that they have a right to even express something. So when we come later to talking about, expressing emotion in this framework that I've created, if you don't actually feel that you have a right to do that, that's going to affect how that comes across. So back to your question about, how can we actually work on this? I think, this is essential to work on because it really impacts how we interact with other people and what we actually do. So one of my favorite exercises on self-worth is to do an exercise which is actually, I've tried to make it really simple, but it's a very, very profound reflection. So it's thinking about 7 basic needs that we have, 7 basic rights in life, and actually thinking through what our own history is on that right, and therefore how much of a challenge self-worth is. And those rights are the right to be, the right to have needs in the first place, the right to be separate from other people, the right to speak our truth, the right to have autonomy with support, the right to love and to have passion about things, and the right to our own spiritual path. And I think that those are seven needs that we have in life. And if we are depleted on any one of those needs, we're going to need to really, really work on this area.
So one of the strategies I saw that you have in the book is about observing someone else that you might think of that might have high self-worth. Now, you don't know their stories, but there's something that's keying you into the fact that these people seem comfortable expressing themselves, seem to have ongoing positive self-talk, seem to believe in their abilities to handle whatever comes. What do you think people see? And when you say observe somebody, how do you do that and not appear like a stalker or something?
Well, I think, the great thing with, there's three key methods accessible to everybody. So one is I would observe people in your own immediate circle of friends and family that you identify as having higher self-worth. So when I think about that question, I think about a friend of mine who I've known for about 3 years, and I notice the pace at which she communicates with other people, and I notice how she looks at people directly in the eye. She never sort of moves away from that direct eye contact. And I also notice that the way that she uses gestures, and also I notice how she stands, and even when she is sitting and communicating with other people, I notice how upright she is. So that's what I mean by that first method, observing people very close to you in your immediate circle. I think a second really powerful method is to actually observe people on TV, both in interviews but also in movies. And of course in movies we know that people are, acting and stage, but actually when you observe different characters in different films. So I recently, for example, was watching that wonderful movie called Me Before You, which is a story of this carer that goes to look after this man who's been in a terrible accident, and it's all about the relationship that they forge. And early in the movie, she is very she's finding it hard to get through to him, but if you just notice how confidently she expresses her various attempts to try and sort of win him over, and she stays completely calm, never gives in to the pressure of the situation. So I think observing people in films can be really powerful. And I think a third method is actually, on TED Talks, observing people who actually convey their key topic and actually seeing, again, how they stand, how they convey their point of view. I think those are three really great methods.
I'd like to point out, too, that in your book you do refer people to your own website, and then within that website you have a lot of resources. So if people say, well, TED Talks, and they don't know what a TED Talk is, for instance, this idea that there are expert speakers who, and if you've never seen a TED Talk, it's really something worth spending some time just Googling TED Talks, and you'll see a whole bunch of things come up. And if a topic interests you, I think they don't make it to a TED Talk unless they're really engaging and they're really interesting. And yet what I want to point out is that in your book you point to lots of web-related resources beyond the book itself.
Yeah, so what I decided to do, when in my first version of the book, there was 5 times the content. So what I decided to do was for people that wanted to go deeper into any specific topic, I would have additional materials. So in the book, in the audio book or in the physical book, there's a specific URL given that gives access to a number of resources. And I picked out, for example, specific talks that I thought were great illustrations of a couple of the topics there. And I was also completely new to TED Talks when someone first mentioned them to me, and I found them to be a really great resource, particularly for studying human nature and seeing how different people convey their messages. So I think that's a really great resource to everybody.
Well, there's another example of something that I think that other people have heard the words before, but you do a nice job explaining it. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about this on this interview as well, is this idea of giving yourself self-affirmations. Some people really struggle with the idea of just, scripting self-talk for themselves that's very positive, and they feel uncomfortable and a bit silly even in saying certain things. But yet it seems to have a power that resonates pretty it can be amazing, actually, for some people in terms of how it begins to help them to turn around. Do you want to talk a little bit about the exercise of self-affirmations, maybe give a couple of examples and why it's
sure. Sure. So affirmations, the way I think about affirmations is really how can we put into our everyday sort of mindset, I guess you could call it, how can we put into our everyday mindset the thoughts and beliefs that are actually going to help us to manage our emotions well and to get the best outcome from a situation. And so affirmations, the way I see it, is that this is how we prepare to do that. So we literally take a sheet of paper and we note down, statements that start with the word I, that are all true statements about what we're good at, what our skills are, what experiences we've had that gave us good learnings. And I think about it as, they're either statements which are something like, I can listen well, I am able to form a healthy relationship, I'm good at making the right decision under pressure, I'm proud of my achievements. So we write down all of those statements, but the key thing about it is that we pick out the 3 statements that are going to help us in a specific interaction. So for example, if I'm doing an interview today with Chuck Wolf on his fabulous program, having affirmations top of my mind like, I care deeply about people being emotionally resilient in life. That is an example of an affirmation that I set at the beginning of today. But also, I'm able to engage other people in my topic. That's an important one. And thirdly, I really appreciate Chuck Wolf because of all that he's given me and, all of the specifics around that.
So I can take one of the things and make a self-affirmation that Gitu thinks I have a fabulous show then.
Well, no, you see, you have to word it as an I statement. I have a fabulous show.
And others think so as well.
And others think so as well. But the key thing with affirmations is that they have to be I statements because it's all about what are the thoughts that we can choose that enable us to have the level of self-worth that's going to enable us to communicate well. Because, we may naturally, as people, I found as a coach, many people don't have high self-worth as a natural given from a young age. And so that's why these affirmations all have the word I. Thanks, Chuck, for listening to my clarification on that. No,
that's actually, I'm very glad that I said what I said jokingly, but it's really important that the I part of it is in there. It's one of the things that in the emotion roadmap, when I have callers, the show normally, for those who are listening to this and just think it's interviews, normally I have callers calling in and they're challenged. They're feeling often helpless about a particular situation in their life, and it's complicated by feelings of strong emotion. And, just as an example, let's say somebody's feeling incredibly anxious and they want to feel confident. And one of the things that I ask them to think about is, has there been a time in your life where you've ever been anxious before, feeling similarly? It may not be at all related, except that the feelings were the same, where you felt terribly anxious, but that you were able to turn it into confidence. And as soon as I ask them to start thinking about that, it's kind of like they start talking to themselves about past successes that they've had. And if they can connect to one, they begin to realize that, hey, wait, I've been in a similar place before, and I managed to come out on the other end in a very successful way. And so maybe there's something that I did there that may have some semblance of relationship to what I'm trying to do here. Even though the circumstances are quite different, the feelings are the same in terms of what I felt and what I wanted to feel. And is there something I can learn from the fact that I've been successful before, turning anxiousness into confidence? And I think it's sort of related to the idea of affirmations. And as soon as that starts to happen, they start to build their own plan for how to deal with whatever it is they might have called about. And then when it's their own plan, it has a lot more chance of being successful than if I simply just told them what I think would work.
Chuck, I really love that suggestion, and I think, what's behind affirmations is actually doing that work on affirmations before the next situation that occurs, so that you've actually got your own sort of data bank of affirmations that relate with your own experiences, your own stories. And I found with this that I remember very distinctly a client I was working with last year. The first time she wrote something down, she had 6 statements. And, I'd given her the challenge of writing 20. She started with 6. And anyway, after a few different, attempts, she ended up with 73 affirmations. And actually, that's the list that is shared as one of the, she gave me permission to share it as a list of examples. And I find that list is really helpful to people because, and I'm more than happy to send that to you if you want to sort of email it out to your readers, to your listeners rather, because it's just really great to work with a list that's already prepared, because it's a lot simpler.
Great. If you want to do that, that'd be wonderful. And if people want to email me about that, they can email me. The email is CJ, for my initials, Charles James, CJ, and my last name, Wolfe, CJWOLFE, at CJWOLFE.com. And I'm happy to send it to anybody who requests it. I want to move on, Gitu, because I think we've done a really nice job, hopefully, for all of you listeners who are thinking about how to raise your self-worth. And, sometimes you might think you're fine, but you might want to do this for somebody that's a colleague, a friend, maybe a parent even, and certainly for your children, that some of these ideas may not be necessary for you at this point. But one of the things that you might want to consider is this idea of sharing some of these thoughts with people that you know that may have some needs in these areas. I do want to move to self-control, because that's another key that you talk about emotional resilience. Begins with self-worth, but self-control is such an important piece on so many dimensions relative to being smart about how you deal with life, particularly the emotional side of life. But really, it has an impact on resilience in the way that you write about it too. So you want to talk a little bit about your thoughts about, self-control, what it is, and how you, again, might build it.
Yeah, I think, self-control is my favorite topic in this entire framework. And, self-control is all about knowing our feelings, in response to everyday work events. So self-control is about knowing that our feelings are under control in response to everyday events. And that's a whole combination of things that we can do in the background. So I think about it as being sort of still and controlled on the inside, and doing everything we can to be still and controlled, so that when we do express something on the outside, it's what we actually mean to say, and it's actually what's relevant to the situation. So we're not just acting out of our histories and our trauma of the past. And I think, early on in emotional intelligence work, I used to, I've done about 35 different assessments. I've taken 35 different assessments of emotional intelligence. And one of the consistent things is I would always come out as having low self-control. But for years, whilst it bothered me, I used to think, oh, well, at least all these assessments are consistent. And I just need to learn, how to count to 10 and just be a bit more measured and thoughtful. But actually, what I realized over time is that there's a little bit more to it than I hadn't really thought about. So firstly, how we deal with distractions. A person with lower self-control is likely to find it really challenging the more we've been using technology-related tools. So, this ability to kind of even like now when you're talking to someone, you get a text message coming through or something else will bleep and, someone else trying to reach you or, and I counted the other day that the average person might have 4 or 5 different methods of people contacting them at any one time. And the person with low self-control really, this can be really challenging. So I think self-control is also important for how do we actually manage ourselves so that we can stay focused. And the other element of it is that if we're not actually working on this at the core, it can become very difficult to actually not only get anything done, but to actually be true to our own values and how we want to live in reacting to things. So that's just a bit more about, why I think this is like a really important activity to focus on. And the piece of it that I really love is, firstly, dealing with distractions, I think, is a key thing, and actually working out a method for that, because once you've actually worked out, for example, the times in the day when you're not going to be contacted by anybody for any type of situation, that gives you the first point on how to stay focused on what you need to do. And then the other aspect of this that I think is really important is actually to be conscious of what actually leads to becoming angry for no reason or for little reason under pressure. And I find that, this acronym HALT, if you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, it's going to be a lot harder to actually manage yourself under pressure. So I mentioned the concept earlier of self-care, really thinking about how are you keeping yourself hydrated, how are you making sure you get enough sleep, how much water do you drink, how are you planning 3 meals a day so that you actually get the nourishment that you need. These things sound very simple and basic, but actually they all matter for your degree of self-control.
Well, it's interesting. A couple of things that I've learned, and sometimes when I talk about self-control on the show, and I'm talking about the emotion roadmap, I'm thinking about my own experiences. I think one of the things that I enjoyed about you was your self-control issues, because I had similar ones. and part of that is we're all on a journey, and we're all working to do as well as we can about our own emotional states and how we manage our relationships with others. But one of the things that struck me was that every once in a while there were certain things that would trigger certain bad experiences for me. It would take me down certain roads I'd been on before, and once I began to realize that the path I was on was a familiar one that almost never ended well, I was able to think of the idea of a roadway as, hey, this is not a road I want to stay on, and if I catch it soon enough, I'm able to exercise more self-control than in the past when I just react. And so part of this is like Pavlov's bell, it's like food's coming, or some trigger that's familiar that I know has a consequence attached to it. If I can somehow change the path I'm on when I realize that's happening, at least for me, that's one of the techniques I advocate for people trying to do better with self-control.
Yeah, and one of the things, I really love what you've just said, Chuck, about that. And for me, I think what's been a big learning is to distinguish a need from an urge. So I think, because I recognized that lower self-control was a pattern that was set from a young age, and it was partly a pattern based on needing to stay very sort of agile and changing, being able to change my thoughts and perspective quickly when that was needed under pressure. I found this distinction between need and urge really key, because, a need is, so like if something comes in and that needs like your attention, the urge might be, it's like, if I give you the example, you sent me an email asking me to send something to you, and I know in the past I would have had the urge to respond quickly and say, oh yeah, here it is, here's what you need, but it won't have been very thought through. So I sort of recognize, okay, so it's my urge to act now but I'm going to stop that. What's needed here is that Chuck has this before we speak, and that's what I need to deliver, and I can do that in my own time at the quality that's going to be right for me.
Yeah, that's
and
really
that
important.
for me is a big distinction that has helped enormously.
I'd like to talk just a little bit because we're both, you live in the United Kingdom, I live in the United States. Both countries are experiencing a lot of trauma these days with, all kinds of events that are taking place, whether it's Brexit, terrorism, shootings. There's just all kinds of things that are happening. And I was struck by a quote that you had in the book by Martin Luther King. It said, under hot buttons, it said, the ultimate measure of a man, and I imagine a woman too, is not where he or she stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he or she stands at times of challenge and controversy. And while it's easy for anybody who's listening to this to say, yeah, I can do that, I can be more in control, but you see something and you consider it an injustice, or you just think it's wrong and you want to react to it. And this is about dealing with others at times when you feel like you've had your buttons pressed. How do you get control back? And that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you as well.
Well, it was very interesting you mentioned Brexit because, as you mentioned, I live in the UK, and I remember in the week leading up to that referendum, I started the week by asking friends how they were going to vote. And I stopped doing that on about day 2 when I started to realize everybody was voting opposite to the way I had planned to vote. And I think one of the key things with this is I think if we can start to notice what is the distinction between our instinctive reactions. In this case, the example I just gave, my instinctive reaction was to talk to people about this. And I was actually invited to various people's, friends' homes to have like a debate about this. But because I realized that actually emotions are running so high on this topic and there was a lot of fear involved, I actually made some very different choices to what I thought I was doing at the beginning of the week. But I think with these hot buttons, and I think that quote that you mentioned, the Martin Luther King quote, I think it's really about noticing what is triggering the emotions, but also what is it that you actually want in this situation. And in this particular situation, I think if I had gone into that bull in a china shop, which, is probably how I would describe myself of about, 12 to 15 years ago, I would have gone to all of those debates. I would have probably lost a lot of close friends in that week when I concluded that we weren't voting the same way. And there would have been a lot of upset. But I actually think it's about saying, what's actually going to be a healthy choice in this moment, because there's so much evidence now that our inability to manage our own anger actually costs us our health. And, I went through 3 years of cancer treatment in my late 30s, when I was 38. And I absolutely know, looking back, that was all related to emotional challenges. And, whilst, I'm not a doctor and I can't know for certain the medical aspects of that, I'm convinced that there was an emotional aspect to that. And I think, asking ourselves what's healthy is a question that we don't often ask. And that, I think, is really linked with this topic of low self-control and the need to shift emotions in the moment.
Well, I think that's, again, I encourage people to get your book and to learn more about this. And I noticed the time, and I want to cover a few other topics with you. And one of the things that strikes me is that sometimes when we're on different sides of the aisle or different sides of an opinion question, and we find that certain topics are just really, really challenging to discuss and to dialogue about. And I know that you talk a little bit about empathy, and in my last show I was talking about this idea of empathy, and a lot of people think that they can be empathetic to other people, and then I toss out a topic. Well, can you be empathetic to somebody who's on the other side? If you believe that abortion is a woman's right to choose, and somebody else that you're talking to believes that it's the death of an unborn child, is there any ability to be empathetic to each other? when you pick something in our country right now, there's I think a huge split between Democrats and Republicans in terms of candidates that they're voting for, and people have a tremendously difficult time talking about politics as well. So there are certain things that just seem really, really uncomfortable. But I think true empathy is to really put yourself in the other person's shoes and to try and see what they see, even when it's incredibly different than what you might feel or think or want to act on yourself. And I think empathy is not as easy as it might sound to be empathetic to somebody else, especially when you disagree on something that's important to you.
It's interesting, Chuck, you mentioned about the political situation going on right now. I actually think on both sides of the Atlantic, I think we've reached a crisis of empathy, of lack of empathy, in the sense that I think that this gap in being able to hear other people is now really, really serious. And in some ways, I think, as a society, we probably need to go through this to actually feel even more of the pain of why this is an issue. So I think the way I think about it is that I don't think we hear people say the words, "I hear you," and really mean it in a conversation. So I think that would be step one on empathy. But I also think that because everybody speaks from their own context and histories, I think being able to hear somebody from their own context is important, and to be able to accept their point of view from their own context, but to be able to express a view based on a better vision, which is a vision for everybody that is beyond your own context. So I think the piece that we really miss is what I've built into my framework on emotional resilience that I call understanding, because to me understanding goes way beyond empathy, and understanding is about how do you actually really understand where people are coming from and be able to acknowledge that and actually build that into how you're operating. And I think that's what's really missing. So I know we've been talking about empathy for at least more than a decade, but I actually think empathy is just the tip of the iceberg.
It's interesting. So if we can generate more understanding with people, can we be more resilient when what we understand is different than what we held as a firm belief before we understood why somebody is different than us?
Yeah, I think understanding is really about saying, well, I appreciate that another person's perspective is different to my own, and maybe based on what they live in their everyday life, that is the right choice. So just coming back to Brexit, just as an example, I remember distinctly 4 weeks ago a friend saying, what they were experiencing in their local town around, this hot topic of immigration. And the thing is, whilst that isn't my own experience, and that particular person made the conclusion that they needed to vote, to leave Europe, and has since regretted it, actually. That person has since regretted that vote because of everything else that has unfolded since. I think it's about being able to say, I understand that your life story is different to my own, and that's the right choice for you. But let me, just share with you the conclusions I've come to. And I think if we're managing our own anger within that, we can communicate our point of view much more elegantly. And I think it's that combination of understanding with self-control that is really missing.
Well, I want to ask you about expressing core feelings as it relates to what we're talking about, at least in the way I think about it. And this is something we'd chat about a bit. And you have a Dr. Seuss quote, which I really like, that says, "Be who you are and say what you feel, because the people who mind don't matter, and the people who matter don't mind." I like that a lot. But one of the things that strikes me was that you chose not to say certain things in the conversation with your friends around Brexit because of what it might mean to them, and you could have lost some friendships. So how do you put that together with expressing core feelings when you look at, if that's advice that you're giving to someone who's reading your book and you want them to feel comfortable saying what they want to say and feeling what they want to feel, But within what context is that okay or not okay?
Yeah, I think Chuck, the question you've just asked is a real $1 million question. When do you know when it's okay to express what you really feel and when is it not? And I think this distinction, which again is down to, what's the best choice you make in the situation. I'm confident that if you are, if we're well rested, we're hydrated, we've done the sort of like background work, we're going to give the authentic response in the moment. So one of the tools I shared in my book, which is something that somebody actually shared with me, and I've tried to sort of like turn it into a tool that can be used every day, is to think about expressing your own feelings, but with a very clear four-part statement. So in this situation, feeling, consequence, request. So in that example that we just shared about that individual, I said something to, the situation is, I'm choosing not to have a debate on this topic. I'm feeling concerned about this upcoming referendum, but I'm very conscious that I need to take care of myself. So the consequence of that is that I'm making some very clear choices about what's healthy for me right now. So my request is that we actually return to this conversation after the vote, when we can actually talk about where we're at with it.
That's very
And that's what I said to her.
That's a great answer. So it's like looking at sort of, again, more of a framework around, just looking at the consequence. Because I've made similar choices, but not necessarily with a framework where I've thought about, is this something I really, you talked about the difference between a need and an urge. And is there a need for me to say something now, or do I have an urge to say it because I just think it's something that's important to say? But maybe the consequence of saying it here and the way I'm thinking about it isn't going to get me the result, and it's going to cause a consequence I'm not comfortable with. So it's not that I'm not being genuine or authentic. It's just that I'm picking my spots and being more thoughtful about how to say what I want to say and get it down in a way that I can be truthful, but pick my own time and place so that I can have the consequence for myself and others that I think would be most useful.
Yeah, I think, Chuck, there's something very key about actually knowing what a core feeling is. And I think, a lot of people can mix up like thoughts as feelings. And I think if we're really clear that the underlying feeling, for example, is fear, then there are certain things you would do with fear to take care of yourself. Mm-hmm. So if I was feeling fearful, for example, in that situation, I can't count on the other person to take care of me and to help me feel less anxious. And going to a debate wouldn't be a way to take care of the anxiety about the vote, the upcoming referendum, for example. And I think it's really just being able to notice, like, what is the core feeling and therefore what to do about it. And what I love about the emotion roadmap, which is, what you've been sort of like advocating for many, many, many years, is that whole ability to actually choose what's right for the situation and actually really learn about what's right. So I think, we're saying very similar things here.
Well, that's great. I want to just, I've noticed the time, and I realize we're getting to the end, and I want to just mention a couple of things about your book that I thought were really interesting. You actually talk about, in terms of relationships with others, this idea of demonstrating caring, and it's really, one of the examples you use is an email format, where somebody who wants to get something done quickly and is achievement-oriented and just writes a sentence or two about what they need from the other person and sends it out, and how that's different than putting a line in front of that, which basically says something personal about the other person, about the fact that you know who this other person is, that you care about this other person, in just a very few words. It doesn't take much time, and yet sends a whole different, I believe it sends, coming across emails, I think you can feel things too, even though you're not seeing a person, you're just reading something. But when something's a little personal and asks a little bit about your world and your situation and demonstrates a bit of caring before your request, it just feels completely different to me. And I think it makes people feel cared about versus how an email that's to the point and practical and says what you need, and yet it feels like this person only contacts me when they need something from me.
Yeah, I think, Chuck, I think with that, I love that, such a simple thing, and I find that either, a sentence at the beginning, if it's a controversial topic, a sentence at the beginning goes a long way. But I also think a sentence at the end is the other way I think about it, because then that's the last thing you're leaving the person at the end of the email. But yeah, it's such an important, simple demonstration of caring, and in our sort of world of short emails and one-liners, I think that goes a long way.
I think so too. I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about, towards the end of the book, you're talking more about energy and thriving and how it relates to resilience. You want to say a couple words about that, Gitu?
Oh yeah, energy. I used to wonder why people were exhausted in the workplace. And when you look at that as a problem, why are people exhausted? So in other words, you have people that are doing fantastic stuff in the community, but actually they're running around trying to meet everybody's needs and actually usually end up pretty exhausted and not taking care of themselves. So really the chapter on energy really brings everything together and looks at what specifically, what are the things that you're doing that really are giving you energy and what's taking energy away. And I think that's a really important thing to work through. But also the idea of thriving is, I really think, when we think about 6 areas of our life, I think about our emotional health is not just one aspect, it's 6 different areas of life. It's our social health, it's our physical health, our spiritual health, our career health, our intellectual health, and also our intellectual health. So in the chapter that I wrote on thriving, we look at these 6 areas of our emotional health and actually create some milestones around them, as well as some practical everyday targets. And I think that, if everybody did that just one thing, to think about how balanced we are in those areas. And I can tell you that, 10 years ago, I don't think I even knew what the word balance meant, frankly, let alone actually trying to live a life, with that. And I think about it as a living legacy. So in the part of the book that's on thriving, I've been to many, many funerals, and frankly, at the end of our life, it's too late. Whatever our religious beliefs are, it's too late to have lived that life that we all, want to lead. So I think about legacy not as something we leave to our loved ones when we're gone, but a living legacy. What is it we're doing right now that's actually serving our community, our families, that we're really proud of, versus, just dragging ourselves into each day.
Interesting. One of the things that I sometimes, when I'm presenting in a keynote speech or in some kind of group format, I'll talk about this idea of when Gallup polls go across North American companies and they poll people to see if they're engaged, disengaged, or actively disengaged, they find that people are often, for the most part, 80% of the workforce is not engaged at a high level. And that seems to be a consistent number that they find year after year. And engagement, to me, is this idea of it's an emotional issue. And when you wonder why people are tired in work and aren't thriving and have lack of energy, it's often because they feel disengaged and they're fighting with themselves just to stay focused during the workday. And I think that one of the things that you end the book with is how important it is for leaders to think about why it is that they may want to bring emotional resilience into their organization. So I wanted to give you a moment to just kind of talk about that. You talked about it from a kind of a world perspective and a life perspective, from a legacy legacy perspective for individuals to think about. What about for leaders, Gitu?
Well, Chuck, I think this is really at the core. People like you and I have been working on emotional intelligence development for a long, long time, close to 2 decades now. And I think the key sort of call to action is that our society is in a mess. You only have to look at the first headline in the news every day to know that we're in a mess. And I think the mess in business is actually one that leaders of business can actually resolve through actually acknowledging that emotion matters for performance in a job, and therefore emotion matters for performance of a business. And many people accept that intellectually, but actually it's the practice where there are sort of gaps. So I think up until now, a lot of leaders think about this as something just for the leaders, and the enlightened ones think about this as a topic that if leaders actually are educated in this, then they can do the right thing. But I actually think now we're in a different phase. I think now it's the leaders to say the gaps that we've overlooked, which are to do with emotion, are gaps that we can fill by the right education, the right development, and now is the time that we need to do that. So emotional resilience is an attempt to actually provide a very practical way with a start point, an end point, the specific education and development that people can go through. And I am hopeful from seeing some of the ways people have started to work with this, that this does give a way for people to have all the resources that they need, the personal, the psychological, the social resources to actually sustain not only high personal well-being, but high performance of an organization.
I want to thank you very much, Gitu, for your time on the phone today. And do you want to talk a little bit about how people can purchase your book?
Sure. So my book is available in paperback and also on Audible as a download in audio format, but we also have an Amazon store with all of the different formats of the book. So you can go to eiworld.org store. In that store, you'll find all of those methods. You can also search it on Amazon.com and other online booksellers.
Thanks very much, Gitu.
Thank you very much, Chuck. It's been a pleasure.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.